Coming up tonight on Student News, some of the largest problems humanity has ever had to face will be those that today's teens and future generations will have to overcome. Most of these challenges were created by current and prior generation, and this leads to the central question we will be examining in this episode of Student News. What obligations does one generation have to the next, and what obligations do we have to future generations?
We will be examining this question and related issues over the next half hour through interviews with adults and teens and a roundtable discussion and expert opinion. It's December 19th, 2011, and Student News starts right now. Good evening, I'm Joshua Wolfson.
And I'm Giovanna Robinson-Heides. Welcome back to Student News. Tonight we begin our look at intergenerational issues with this country's third president. On September 6, 1789, while in France, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to his good friend and primary architect of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison. In it, he laid out his initial thoughts on the rights of different generations. Jefferson wrote, quote, "The question whether one generation of men has right to bind another is a question of such consequences as not only to be merit decision, but place also, among the fundamental principles of every government. I set out on this ground that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it." Long before Jefferson set out on this concept of usufruct, that the earth belongs to the living and the people have common ground to benefit from it, numerous other writings, going back to the Bible and Plato, grappled with intergenerational rights and the degree to which the land or fruits of the land could benefit or be passed down to future generations. Jefferson, however, put his own spin on the issue. He set forth the premise that it was self-evident that the earth belongs to the living temporarily, and only to the extent that those peoples don't harm it for those coming after them.
Jefferson asserted that while each generation should have power or sovereignty during their time of majority, they also have an obligation to not use up all the resources or irrevocably harm the land that belongs to future generations. In other words, Jefferson argued that we have an obligation to future generations who do not exist yet, generations that can have no say in how resources should be used. Does today's generation have an obligation to preserve resources for later generations who may desire them later? It is also true that later generations may benefit from what our generation has produced with those resources, just as we have benefited from the work of earlier generations. These generational divides, generational sovereignty, and the fact that time forever marches forward raise serious moral, legal, and ethical concerns. What is our obligation to future generations and past generations? What are infringements on generational sovereignty? And when is it okay to take actions whose effects will outlive the person making them? The examination of these problems is the study of intergenerational justice.
Intergenerational issues are not simply theoretical discussions, but are at their heart practical and of serious relevance to today's world. Our society is still impacted by hundreds of years of intergenerational decisions, and we currently hold the power to shape the world for hundreds of years to come. The United States currently has a national debt of more than $15 trillion, and current projections by the Congressional Budget Office indicate that the national debt will stand at $17 trillion by 2015. If this debt is not cut down, it will eventually have to be paid off, but not by those who are currently racking up the debt. It will be paid by today's teens and children of their children. Population growth will also have intergenerational implications. If current generations continue to reproduce larger and larger numbers of children, they will necessarily cause a shortage of resources and a shortage of space for future generations.
Perhaps most significantly, from an intergenerational standpoint, global warming and environmental destruction will have negative effects for centuries and will be the direct result of current generations' actions. In May, attorneys for 4 teenagers in California filed 52 separate lawsuits, one for each state and for the federal government, to halt the growth of greenhouse emissions within the United States. The suits claimed that the U.S. government has failed to fulfill its obligation to protect the atmosphere for future generations. Julie Olson, lead attorney for the Oregon-based nonprofit Our Children's Trust, said of the case, quote, What courts can do is they can take the politics out of atmospheric protection. They can put the science back in. They can establish the threshold of what needs to be done and tell the government, you need to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by 6% a year so we can protect the atmosphere for future generations.
The long-term consequences of today's actions surrounding the debt crisis, population control, the environment, and numerous other issues will affect today's teens and future generations. What are long-term priorities, and how do teens and adults today grapple with both our current reality and what are we passing off to future generations?
Student News reporters Hannah Viederman, Zoe Langsdale, and Jesse Chasen-Tabor sat down with teens and adults to find out their perceptions on the state of our world and its future. Take a look.
The environmental impact that we have now can't create a world in which there's just a different situation for humans to live in. I think we have to protect our environment now so that, above all else, so that future generations can still have a world similar to the one we have.
I definitely agree with Jamin. However, I do think that we also need to pay attention to the economic crisis in our nation right now. There are many people without jobs, and I think that that should be one of our priorities in order to bring back prosperity to this nation.
It has to start now, and it is starting now. You can look at the headlines and you can see that we're really nationally in the mood for serious debate about debt growth and management of costs. So I'd say the time is now. Is what's going on now driven by one generation over another? I think it's a multi-generational issue, and it's a multi-generational action.
I personally believe that global warming is the biggest problem that humanity right now faces, especially in regard to future generations and how it will affect them. I personally believe that the economy is not as much one. The economy, in what I've watched, policy can straighten out the economy in shorter time periods than, say, global warming. Right now, global warming, because of what's happened already, will affect the world almost forever, and already has implications on future generations, where the economy, it's a much more at-a-time problem, where, excluding the Great Depression, it's much easier to resolve these economic issues.
The sort of short-term attention span of most voters and the fact that most people don't vote, a lot of people don't vote, that getting someone to pay attention to things that like climate change that they can't see or deforestation that's far away from them, I think is a real struggle.
At the risk of putting words in a lot of people's mouths at once, most adults are most concerned about getting through their own lives, which is certainly challenging enough. So the perspective of what future generations are facing is not a priority question for people who've already made it into adulthood.
As in, if you look all across the globe, there's still countries in which women are not allowed to drive, women are not allowed to vote. We should be able to instill for future generations just some sense, some obligation of, equality, of fairness, so that everyone can live in better circumstances.
I believe that these generations, they should have a certain set of self-determination, and a future generation should be allowed to make its own values, or a child in a future generation should be able to choose what they believe. But I do believe that many of these values are passed down and come from parents and past generations, and so this teaching of values from a parent to a child prolongs these values so much so that it is not necessarily a choice, as it's just what they've always been raised as, and it's just what how they've always seen the world.
Well, I mean, you have an obligation to have values. When you have values and they're yours, it's going to be one of your priorities to pass that on. I guess I hesitate to phrase it as an obligation, because it's the natural outcome of having values. If you value it, you're going to want to share it. And if you're not passing it on, then I'd argue you probably don't really value it.
I mean, I would like to say that I think a main part of parenting is not only bringing up your kids, but also instilling in them a certain amount of values and kind of teaching them what you know and think about the world. But I do think that most importantly, really for a parent, is to teach their kid to be open-minded to a certain extent, so that when they're old enough and when they're capable of making their own decisions, they can do so.
I just think that in an ideal situation, values should not be imposed on any person or any nation. However, in a real life situation, that's so much more easier said than done. When you think about a government, in order to maintain order and anything like that, they do need to have some sort of foundation to what they're saying, and in that case they are imposing some sort of values, but we cannot blame them or reprimand them for it.
I think that giving children the option to do something along that sort, to have a better education, or maybe just more opportunities in general, I think that is something that we should definitely be providing for the next generation.
The foundation of our nation was, in some senses, very vague, in the sense that they say that we need to protect our natural liberties, which are very simple things such as like pursuit of happiness and then liberty, and I mean very ideal sentiments that somebody should have. And in that sense, I think it's fine to keep those, but I think over time our government has evolved in a sense that it's not just what we started with originally, but things have been added on that maybe that in a sense that we sometimes even contradict nowadays when we go into other countries. We are now violating their sovereignty while we started our constitution on the sense that we wanted our own freedom.
Yeah, I think no question that the founding fathers, their main idea would be to open doors and increase freedom as opposed to close them and kill freedom itself. But I think the way that they left things open, that's a good policy. And I think they assumed that these things would be adapted as the years went on.
I personally don't think so much about an allegiance necessarily to a past generation. I think of it more as something that is dynamic. So in other words, everything from how to interpret the Constitution and what those founding fathers are saying, it's a different world today. And so I would want to adapt to that. By the same token, I don't want to think in terms of live for today, forget about tomorrow, forget about the past.
I don't believe that laws are necessarily a way that we are infringing or imposing upon future generations, in that the founding fathers especially created the mechanisms to repeal laws. And I think that alone was a statement that these laws are meant to be changed, amended, and that they did not want to impose their necessary beliefs on future generations, and that as long as we keep these mechanisms, we are not doing the same.
I mean, I don't want to seem overly patriotic, but I mean, I still do believe every bit in what our country is founded upon, which is just the basic freedoms in which we, as individual people and as a united people, e pluribus unum, many united as one, are given. And I think that the judicial system every bit helps us to continue democracy as it should. As in, there do need to be rules set in place. We cannot be free to the point in which anything can happen, in which murder can occur. That is absurd. But I think that obviously it's been a success. I mean, if you look around the world, countries are becoming more American as the days go on, and more. I mean, people would argue that's bad, but I think that it has worked. It continues to work, and I think that we have gained more freedoms than many other people throughout the course of all of human history.
On the one hand, fortunately, what's built into the Constitution is enough of a dynamic system because it is open to interpretation. So that even just that classic right to bear arms, did they mean militias or did they mean individuals? And it also then varies by state. So if some states have much stricter gun laws than other states. And those things are reversible, but then they're so beholden to who is on the Supreme Court. And who is on the Supreme Court then becomes beholden to the other aspects of our political system.
Well, I would definitely say that with certain things, certain parts of the Constitution are things that are obviously beneficial to freedom in the country. So certain things, the First Amendment is the epitome of freedom, essentially. And so there's really no need for that to ever be overturned. If I can move on to the second part of that question, I think I wouldn't say I buy into the idea of owing things to past generations. I mean, they won't mind whatever we do. So, I mean, they did what they thought was best for us, and their time on Earth was hopefully good for them, but I don't think once they're gone, there's no more debt to them.
The best way for a generation to have its own values is to take what's already there and change them if necessary. For the second part, I would agree with Jamin. I do not believe we owe anything more, and I believe that much more important than taking care of past generations is taking care of future generations.
And now for a broader view on intergenerational issues and how they affect us today, and why we should care, we turn to University of Oregon Professor John Davidson and California State University Professor David Leach.
There was a period of time where all of this was vastly more present in people's minds in certain types of ways than it is now. Where we see it, I mean, I do think we see it today in a couple of places. One of them, obviously, is in certain elements of the right. Someone like Patrick Buchanan, very interested in questions of intergenerational justice. Obviously, I think he's coming at it from a fairly particular viewpoint, but questions of immigration policy, questions of the Muslim diaspora, questions of multiculturalism and its successor failure in Europe, these are clearly questions that are tied into intergenerational justice, at least in certain ways. I also think you see it on the left, and on the left it tends to be less about multiculturalism and much more about economic issues. I don't think it's too challenging to understand the Occupy Wall Street protests on at least partially intergenerational terms, and very interesting ones, because what you have is the presence of a generation that is coming up. Very rarely, I mean, as you know, the core problems of intergenerational justice is that you can't ask future generations what they want. And in fact, the choices that you're going to make are going to have a structuring effect on precisely who the later generations are. But in Occupy Wall Street, one thing that you arguably see is a generation that is not yet empowered, but that sort of reaching an age where it's going to start to take over leadership positions in the country. This generation is trying to articulate intergenerational issues in terms of debt, in terms of student loans, in terms of basic social structures.
Global warming is one of the most obvious examples that basically Obama has punted on that over and over and over again because there's no clear political benefit to addressing the issue, and certainly the Republicans aren't even looking at it. I think for them to take certain kinds of holistic intergenerational issues seriously, especially the sorts of ones that require multilateral international action or large-scale government intervention, I feel like they're reluctant to recognize that those problems exist, because if those problems do exist, they don't fit comfortably into the sorts of ideological positions and routines and mechanisms that they're used to dealing with. The Republicans run away from it, and the Democrats really are more concerned with getting elected the next time around, and future generations don't vote, and so for the most part those issues are ignored.
But at the same time, we see clearly an opening up of opportunities for future generations. The generation that comes after us, our children, are going to have a much richer set of possible marital and romantic arrangements that will be certainly culturally recognized and in all likelihood legally recognized. That strikes me as a meaningful improvement in people's lives. I think that this is where the central tension in thinking about what obligations we owe to future generations. Is it the case that we owe them particular structures and institutions that have tended to enrich and improve and positively affect their own lives, or do we owe children or future generations an open future? Do we owe them minimal structuring?
At its best, conservatism is about preserving things of well-recognized value, and so it makes sense that there's going to be a conservative element.
For example, it means that there are probably certain forms of environmental degradation that you just can't justify on the grounds that it's going to meaningfully enhance the ability of future generations to make meaningful choices on their own, but that there are other forms of structuring, economic structuring, political structuring, not overturning the First Amendment, not overturning the Ninth Amendment, 10th Amendment.
At its best, entrenched constitutional provisions and stare decisis, when they're designed to protect the flexibility of later when they're designed to keep open channels of potential change and convincing people of other things, or keep open basic sorts of freedom and dignity, so that people can participate fully as citizens and bring about changes and things like that. In that case, you're paradoxically limiting the sovereignty of the majority at any given time, but you're doing it to protect the ability of the society as a whole to change and progress and evolve over time.
Obviously, it's not simply the case that any reversible action is justifiable and any irreversible action is non-justifiable. Obviously, it's more complicated than that. But to the extent that a polity or a community is able to meaningfully reverse an action, then I think there's at least a prima facie way in which that ability makes their choices in regards to that action much more meaningful. Environmental degradation is sort of the signal example here. Extinct species don't come back, and there's a problem of reversibility. I mean, there's obviously this sort of problem of almost luck egalitarianism. Why should you, because you haven't lived in this generation, get to make the choice to drive the species to extinction when there's something morally arbitrary about your generational placement? I think that there's that issue, but more than that is that once a species gets extinct, future generations lack the ability to make meaningful choices as regards to that species. There's an irony, of course, in that preserving the ability of future generations to act meaningfully might restrict your own choices quite meaningfully, and so you could argue that there are ways in which the need to preserve reversibility, or the privilege you give to reversibility as a structuring concept in intergenerational justice, ends up for every given generation meaningfully restricting their choices. I'm not sure that that's an easy irony to get out of.
One way or another, we're going to create posterity. We're going to form their identity. We've got depending on what policies we choose, it's going to affect the number of them that exist. It's going to affect the values that they have. It's going to affect the level of education they have. And so part of our obligation is to exercise responsibly that power that we have in determining who they're going to be and how many of them there are going to be. So, the population policies we adopt, the public education policies we adopt, are important. And as far as population goes, we've been completely irresponsible. For the most part, we avoid it. We avoid discussing it on the international level and the national level. It crops up in immigration debates a little bit, but for the most part, we're afraid of it. We're afraid because it touches on that area of reproductive rights that both conservatives and liberals are attached to in one way or another. In terms of public education, historically, we've taken that very seriously. It's not a coincidence that Thomas Jefferson was, one of the first people who pushed the public education program and was also, one of the earliest comprehensive philosophers about intergenerational justice, because he recognized that, part of giving later generations a good world was giving them the set of skills, the intellectual skills and the philosophical skills they would need to shape their world and to respond to new circumstances.
I think that there are fairly strong limitations to predicting exactly how education is going to affect future generations. Now, this doesn't mean that we should just sort of throw our hands up in the air and wash our hands. This is unpredictable, and so there's nothing to be done. I think we still have very strong responsibilities to try and provide children or provide future generations justice or a good life. But we should also recognize that that's not going to be ultimately determined solely by our actions in this generation.
The problems that you guys are going to be faced with, your generation is going to be faced with, are complicated, and they're going to get more complicated as our technology improves and as the intricacies of our economic and financial systems grow. It's going to be hard to resolve those sorts of issues, and when we don't educate people to the extent that they're able to understand those issues and understand the ways in which the institutions that they're participating in are manipulating them and controlling their lives and ultimately controlling their own children's lives. We make it hard for them to fix things, and so that's a problem.
The mystery of future generations, not knowing who they're going to be, the weight of responsibility can make it very, very hard to think about just political action. I mean, it enlarges the scope of people affected to this infinite degree that can make it very hard to remain positive, very hard to think about meaningful political action, very challenging to think through how you can act ethically, and that can lead to either despair on the one hand or paralysis, both of which I take to be bad. On the other hand, it's incredibly invigorating. I mean, this is the positive side. When you start to think about things in terms of generations rather than the people who are around right now, it gives you a different perspective and sort of forces you into a different perspective that can allow you to really take awareness of the consequences of your actions, to take awareness of the consequences of your inaction in a way that can be very, liberating is the wrong word, but can be very heartening, can resituate things in a very important way, can connect you to stuff that is larger than yourself. And that's I think really important. So on the one hand, you have these sort of terrors of despair and paralysis, but on the other hand, there's this tremendous motivation, this tremendous bank of reasons to get involved, of reasons to care, and this tremendous sense that there are ways in which justice, in which we've gotten closer to justice, in which we've gotten better at justice.
Long-term intergenerational justice, I think, has to be part of that larger effort that we're all concerned with, you know, whether we're conservatives or liberals or Democrats or Republicans. I think ultimately we all need to be thinking in those terms, and that's somewhere where we could find common ground. And we shouldn't be arguing about how best we can rape and pillage the inheritance of posterity. We should be arguing about how best we can, you know, further our own different visions of what's good for them in the long term.
Yeah, there's an argument that the past 10 years has been, at the global scale, in terms of setting up steady institutions for later generations, the best decade that we've ever seen. As Americans, I think it's very, very hard to realize that this might be the case, but there are many more people now living on more than $1 a day or more than $2 a day than there ever have been. When you think about things in terms of generations, about the sustainability of that $2 a day line, they can be a tremendous resource for hope.
Just spending time thinking about it, I think, shifts your identity in the way that, to the extent that you identify with something, you know, a club or your family or your state or your nation or your religion, it becomes fuller and richer. You're identifying with it as something that you participate in as one, you know, link in a chain. And so you connect more with both the past and the future. If we're going to survive in a meaningful way, if any of the causes that we work for are to prevail in a long-term meaningful way, in a way that matters, then you have to think this way.
Thanks to David Leach and John Davidson for discussing these issues with us. And that's it for us tonight. If you would like to learn more about the show, get involved, or donate money, please visit our website at www.riverwolfproductions.org/studentnews. Until next time, I'm Giovanna Robinson-Heides.
And I'm Joshua Wolfson. Stay strong and stay proud. Have a good night. See you next time.